Denver Broncos General Manager George Paton shared personnel updates at the NFL Scouting Combine, including Javonte Williams, who could be on track for the start of the season. We dive into that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day you can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch on YouTube. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more every single day, all year long. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert at predominantlyorange.com. The NFL Scouting Combine is always a treat for us every single year because we get to hear from the Broncos head coach. We get to hear from the Broncos general manager about, scouting, looking at their coaching staff and even evaluating in-house guys in free agency, which we highlighted on yesterday's episode of the show. But we got to hear from George Paton. We got to hear from Sean Payton, and we got to get a little bit more insight, especially from Sean Payton himself, on the process of hiring the coaching staff that he did and why it took as long as it did.
We did, and you know what? His candor is really fun. It makes the whole process of this, at the Combine, what's the number one thing we always hear, Cody? It's coach speak. It's general manager speak. They're out there saying all the different cliches that you hear every single year. But with Sean Payton, he kind of just cutting to the chase, and he was really commanding the podium. I love he was asked about Vic Fangio, and he kind of jokingly said, Vic was part of the plan, and then you guys, meaning the media, scared him off. It's one of those things, like, it's funny because it's true type of jokes, but man, it was interesting to hear him talk about just the full gambit of topics, the different things, the process, the staff in general. He went into detail on a number of the hires that they made, including the new trainer, for lack of a better term. Can't remember his official title with the team, but everything from that to Vance Joseph, to the assistants, to the age and experience of guys on the staff. Really, really good stuff from Sean Payton. But obviously, really the biggest news, I think, lately for that staff is the fact that he rehired Vance Joseph as the defensive coordinator. And he made no bones about the process involving Vic Fangio at the beginning. So it sounds like he was really impressed by Vance, his interview process, and specifically what he did at his previous stop with the Cardinals.
He mentioned as well, he said, interviewing these guys, he mentioned Matt Patricia, Rex Ryan, Sean Desai. He brought those guys up and said, they were really great interviews, he said. But in the end, there were a few things that I felt Vance was going to bring to us as a football team. And he even mentioned what he was able to do, believe it or not, in Arizona. He even mentioned that was a tough job for a number of years, which I think you can make the argument, playing in that division, especially when they did have Russell Wilson in that division with Seattle, and you have the personnel. You look at all the offensive struggles that the Cardinals have had in the last 2 years. The defense really hasn't been the issue. They've suffered because of it, because of being on the field longer, injuries being one of them. But I think this is just another point where Broncos fans have to give trust to Sean Payton, that there's a reason why he chose Vance Joseph out of Rex Ryan, Matt Patricia, and Sean Desai. And heck, he even mentioned Matt Patricia as well in his press conference in front of the media at the NFL Scouting Combine, saying that he was expecting to meet with him at some point during the Combine. So there's still a chance that Matt Patricia joins the Broncos coaching staff. Ian Rappaport even brought this up as well in some sort of capacity. I'm not sure what the role will be, maybe as a senior assistant, because that's what he's been for the New England Patriots, for Bill Belichick for many years. There's a lot of respect there. And he mentioned, we've had training camps together, we've had preseason games against each other, and he said, I've always had respect for him. So we'll see. The Broncos coaching staff is not entirely filled out. Most of the position, the assistant coaches, those are all filled out. But there's some personnel and upper echelon type assistant roles that are still being finalized as we speak here. And I think it's interesting that Matt Patricia was brought up there. But I think we have to highlight and pinpoint two in-house guys from last year's coaching staff that he brought up specifically, Christian Parker and Marcus Dixon. And he kind of said right away that he understood why, when first glance meeting, and he understood why the Broncos really like those two guys.
He did. You get a chance for Sean Payton's perspective to hear what other people say about them. It's kind of like, how you and I approach Cody when the Broncos bring in somebody from another team, and you kind of look to see, hey, what are the fans of that team saying, or what are other people involved in that organization? What do they say when somebody good leaves? It's kind of the similar tactic that Payton used, in regards to Marcus Dixon and Christian Parker, right? He was listening to what other people were saying, and he said the reviews were so glowing that by the time he got a chance to meet with them, I think that was basically the cherry on top, right? So just really impressed by those two guys, and I think rightfully so, right? That's huge for those guys to be able to stay on his staff, for other people to speak so highly of them. And you can't help but wonder, that was probably coming from guys like George Paton, probably coming from people in the front office saying, look, these are some coaches that have a really bright future in the league. And Sean Payton did well to recognize that and to keep them on. Like, you don't have to come in and just blow everything up. I know Josh McDaniels likes to operate that way with roster and coaches, but you don't have to do that. If you're a new coach coming in, you can, believe it or not, keep coaches from the previous regime. And I think that that's something that Sean Payton, keeping an open mind, that's going to be advantageous for him, because look, we talk about Vic Fangio kind of jokingly, but he discussed the fact that, like, he was talking with Vic during last year when both of them were quote unquote retired. He said that they were saying, hey, half the league runs your defense, Vic. And look, Christian Parker, who was he handpicked by? Vic Fangio. So I think we're going to see some of those concepts included in what Vance Joseph is doing. If Matt Patricia comes on as a senior assistant, like you mentioned, we'll see a lot of those concepts being mixed in. Remember, Bill Belichick and the Patriots, they utilized that to beat the Los Angeles Rams in the Super Bowl a few years back, after Chicago kind of had that early exit in the playoffs. So you see what works against great teams. Christian Parker obviously knows that system and scheme very well. I think a very smart idea to bring him in terms of what they want to do coverage-wise and what's so on trend in the league.
I like what Sean Payton even mentioned as well. I mean, he comes from the Bill Parcells coaching tree, and a lot of what he said was reflective on, this is how I am operating as a coach. And he said, when I was coaching with Bill always wanted younger coaches around him. He says, not like I'm young anymore. I like to think that I'm younger. He said, but I always value, because the game is changing every single year, and you get to hear new insights, new perspectives, and you get to also kind of help grow and help mold these coaches as well. And he even mentioned, he made a funny liner, whereas when he was calling plays for Bill Parcells, and he said, you make a play call, and the head coach in the speaker is like, I don't know about that call. It works and it's great. And if not, you're like, you hear the grunt. So that's how he's going to be, especially, with the guy like Joe Lombardi as the offensive coordinator, who he has tremendous familiarity with. They've worked 12 years together in totality, coaching alongside one another. So that's going to be the dynamic we see in Denver. The Bill Parcells approach is coming. I mean, it's here. Sean Payton is encompassing that, because that's what he learned under, and hopefully, Sayre, it leads to more wins for the Broncos during his tenure as the head coach. Can they get back to a Lombardi trophy? At the end of the day, that's the ultimate goal, but it's a race between 31 other teams and yourself in that situation. Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. We're going to be talking about George Paton, who met with the media at the NFL Scouting Combine, and he shared various insights and updates on various in-house personnel, his perspectives from the scouting department, working with Sean Payton, and much more. A lot of great insight from the Broncos GM. You get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. And the midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, it's secure, and it's super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained in a game, just in time for the NBA playoffs coming up here in just a month. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to go get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. It's always great to hear from Broncos general manager George Paton when he has a chance to speak to everybody off script. Like the times we've been able to see him in the last couple of months, it was when they had to fire a head coach and when they had to hire a head coach. Usually you want to get a bigger picture, like, what are your thoughts on the personnel of the season? We didn't necessarily get too much of that from George Paton when he had to fire Nathaniel Hackett, when he had to hire Sean Payton. We got that at the NFL Scouting Combine. His thoughts on some of the personnel, some guys who were set to be free agents. And I would say like the most important thing that we're going to take from George Paton's presser has to do with Javonte Williams. And he mentioned, Sayre, he mentioned that the belief in the initial conversations that have been had, Javonte is, in his opinion, on track for the 2023 regular season. However, he didn't make any guarantees, but he did say that, and if he's not, we will have a plan in place for him.
Yep, no guarantees, which is pretty on par with what we've been hearing and thinking, Cody, right? As we just talked the other day about, the Broncos really can't rely on whatever they're going to get from Javonte Williams to start this. It was a significant knee injury that he suffered last year. So for George Paton to reveal that he's on track to be ready for the start of the season without giving any sort of specific dates, right? Because the start of the season could mean a number of things. It could mean early in the season. It could mean week 1. It could mean who knows exactly what that means. I don't even know if George Paton himself knows at this point, but it's a very positive update nonetheless regarding Javonte Williams. Paton noted that he's been jogging. He looks good. He's feeling good. So, man, I mean, if you're a Broncos fan and you've been really optimistic that Javonte is going to be back in the lineup just 1 year removed from this knee injury, this is about the best possible update as you could have really gotten. In addition to the fact that George Paton understands, like, the running back position is going to need to be added to this offseason. And he talked about it's a deep free agent class. It's a deep draft class. So what does that mean? Yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like, I don't know. When you hear these guys talk at the combine, Cody, you kind of try to like, okay, is it like a reverse psychology thing, or is he being honest? Like, is he going to go after the depth of these running back classes, or is he going to invest big time in somebody like we talked about, with the new connections of the new running backs coach, some of the offensive staff maybe being connected to guys like Josh Jacobs, David Montgomery, Kareem Hunt, and others? Could they make a big splash, or will they take advantage of the depth by going for a, lower risk, potential higher reward type player at that position? Very interesting comments from George Paton regarding the running position as a whole, but it seems like what did he say? 9 guys on his depth chart that they had last year at some point or another. I think they are going to address this position, and he said as much.
Well, and he also mentioned that once we get back from the combine, we're going to spend, a good portion. I think it was Sean Payton who said this, a good portion of 2 days going even deeper on personnel, in-house guys, and things like that. Obviously, conversations will be had this week, but the focus will primarily be on looking at prospects. The scouting staff is there, new Broncos coaches, position coaches. They're all out there in Indianapolis watching, and then they're going to take all their meeting notes and they're going to combine them, not only just at the free agency, but they're going to compile that process. The scouting department's going to begin that immediately now, all the way through the NFL draft, whereas the coaches, they'll put some notes together, but then free agency is going to be the forefront. Then they transition into draft mode. I'm excited for it. It gives us a lot to talk about. There are a lot of angles we'll look at. I also felt it was interesting that George Paton mentioned, he said that Chase Edmonds will be back, right? And as we all know, and you and I have discussed this ad nauseum here on this podcast, is it going to be on the same deal, or are they going to restructure? Because if Denver cuts him, they can save around $5 to $6 million. However, if you restructure him, and this is something that Edmonds even alluded to in the locker room, he says he knows that conversation is probably going to be had, but he's also mentioned he wants to play here. He wants to play with Russell Wilson. And as we saw last year, he does provide a little bit of an explosive dynamic out of the backfield as a pass-catching running back, which you need that on your team to complement, I would say, the more physical style of runners.
You do. And I think that he would be kind of a sleeper player at that position, because remember last free agency that he signed a pretty lucrative deal with the Miami Dolphins, right? And I think a lot of people felt going from Arizona, going to play for Mike McDaniel in Miami, like things are going to really work out for Chase Edmonds, and it's going to be an opportunity for him to really be that running back number 1. And that's where people's mindset was at with him just a year ago, not even a year ago, last March. So really, I don't see that he has that diminished of value that you would say, no, you got to cut him, got to get that cap savings, got to move on, got to get somebody new. Chase Edmonds is a good player, and I think that he deserves an opportunity to be out there. But do you let that move, whether, however you bring him back, whether it's on his current deal, a restructured deal, do you let that prevent you from going after somebody else? Or do you lower the bar and say, hey, we're going to eliminate this tier of guys from the free agency pool, or we're not going to take a guy in the draft until this point because we have him? I don't think he prevents you from making a substantial investment, right? I think you can bring him back into the fold, let him be somebody that competes for snaps and keeps you comfortable, allows you to sleep at night knowing that if we can let Javonte Williams recover at his pace. If he's ready for week 1, boom, full send. If he's not ready, we got Chase Edmonds. We got, so-and-so we signed in free agency. We drafted this guy. We brought back Latavius Murray. We are ready to go. There's other ways the Broncos can build this running back room. And I think Sean Payton made it pretty clear. Remember when he was kind of joking around with Josh Jacobs, that he likes the multi-back system. So fantasy football players out there, shed your tears, do your thing. I think we're going to see a very much so by committee approach to keep these backs in Denver as fresh as possible.
And we believe in that. I think in today's NFL, we mentioned the anomalies, the Derrick Henrys, though I would argue at this point of Derrick Henry's career, you need another back behind it because he can't consistently deal with all this wear and tear. I mean, he's a great back, but it's going to, I think, shorten the length of his career. But, these guys are unbelievable athletes. They take great care of their bodies. Nutrition's unbelievable. Things to look at. In terms of some other personnel things that were mentioned, that were brought up, Alex Singleton, George Paton said we'd like to have him back. He was a baller last season. I think we're all in agreement. We would like Alex Singleton back here in Denver. And then, he made the not-so-subtle mention that, hey, we need to upgrade the offensive line, which we're all in agreement on here. The offensive line has to be upgraded. He was asked about Garrett Bowles. He believes he's going to be healthy, but part of me is also believing, look, those trade rumblings that happen with Garrett Bowles potentially being on the block, there's some smoke to that, Sayre, and I think it's going to be very, very important to see how these next couple of weeks play out leading up to free agency and maybe even going into the NFL draft. It could lead all the way up into that as to what Denver decides to do. And part of that's going to tie into what we're going to talk about next. We're going to decipher some of these comments that Sean Payton and George Paton made, including how talks have gone with Draymond Jones' agent so far in negotiations for a potential long-term contract extension. On top of that, could the Broncos look to add draft picks? You'll get that and much more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But before we dive deeper into that, I wanted to tell you about the Locked On Nuggets podcast. If you're a Broncos fan, you always watch Locked On Broncos every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch on YouTube. What if I were to tell you that while in season and while the number one seed in the Western Conference, the Denver Nuggets have a Locked On podcast for you to listen to, hosted by Adam Matas and Matt Moore. They bring you all the pick and roll action of Nikola Jokic, Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., and this Denver Nuggets basketball team that is looking to hold on to the 1 seed and make a strong push for a potential NBA championship. They have you covered on your favorite audio podcasting platform or on YouTube as well. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. One of our favorite exercises to decipher the comments of the head coach, of the general manager, coach speak, GM speak, and with a little bit of experience in the football side of things, it's easy to decipher what is what. But Sayre, the Broncos contingent of George Paton and Sean Payton, as we mentioned, meeting with media at the NFL Scout and Combine ahead of a very, very busy week for the organization. They have a lot that they're looking at, and there are a lot of other things, as we would say, like icing on top of the cake that they're going to address, and we got some insight from that. I just want to say real quick, thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Sayre and I, we appreciate you so much. Whether you listen on your favorite audio podcasting platform every single day, Monday through Friday, we got you covered, or whether you watch on YouTube, we just surpassed 9K subscribers. We appreciate all of you so much in Broncos country. Now we move on to 10K on YouTube. But with that said, talks with Draymond Jones' agent, George Paton said, let's look into it from is this GM speak or is this truth? He mentioned that talks are very positive. While this is usually a GM speak term, the delivery in which Paton said it, I believe that they're probably on task, because not only did he mention talking with Kyle McCarthy, his agent, he's also talked with Draymond Jones specifically and mentioned him as a core player, which in our head, I know we were thinking, he mentioned him as a core player. Does that mean he's going to keep him, or does it mean he's going to go elsewhere? I mean, interesting things here. What were your thoughts on what Payton had to say about Draymond?
Again, I think as we talked about in our episode yesterday, Cody, I think that this is the most optimistic I've been feeling regarding Draymond Jones. Like the updates continue to pour in. Look, deadlines spark action. We know that, right? And so what's the deadline right now? Well, 1 week from today is the deadline to apply the franchise tag to your players if you're going to do it. And we saw Washington, they just did it for Daron Payne, their defensive lineman. So you see other teams getting involved in this mix. The Broncos did not act quickly to give Draymond Jones the franchise tag, which means to me, Cody, that is last resort. Like you can read into the comments all you want. When you look at what's actually happening, the fact that they didn't quickly move to do that indicates to me they are actively talking. They're actively trying to get something going. They're actively trying to find that common ground. There may be a point where Draymond says, look, I want to hit the open market. I want to see what's out there. But we know a lot of those discussions happen at the combine in Indianapolis. So I think we'll have a very good idea when this week is done to really be able to say, yeah, the Broncos and Draymond Jones, they're either coming close or they're very far apart. If they're far apart, he's going to get the franchise tag. I think so. I don't know that for a fact. George Paton didn't say that. But since we're reading into the situation, Cody, I feel very strongly that things are progressing toward him getting a long-term deal. It sounds like he's the core player thing. We've heard that about guys like Bradley Chubb. We heard it about Cortland Sutton. We heard it about Justin Simmons. All those guys, I mean, the Broncos have had extension talks with all of them, and they signed a couple of them to extensions. So I feel like Draymond is an extension type of guy. What do you say?
I think he is as well, and I kind of put this out over at milehighsports.com yesterday about how big the Combine week is, because it's going to lead all the way up to March 6th. March 7th is what? The franchise tag deadline. So, as you and I have discussed, yes, if you franchise tag Draymond, it's going to be around $19.7 million. You can pretty much round up to about $20 million for him, and there's no guarantee that he would play on the franchise tag. However, if Denver franchise tags him, Sayre, that gives them another deadline, right? July 15th to work up to get to that threshold of a new contract extension, which, while you franchise tag him, is going to count for $19.7 million towards the cap. But if you get a contract extension done by that July 15th deadline, it'll change your salary cap going into the season a little bit. So I want to pinpoint that as something to keep note of for the Broncos in terms of dates and deadlines. I do not think Denver is going to let Draymond just walk. I just don't see that happening considering where they are at, and considering some of the mentions that even Sean Payton brought up about the defensive line and Vance Joseph, and what Vance had said about the defensive line in his interview. He believes that some of his fronts and some of his stunts will bode well with what they want to do defensively. Draymond is a huge part of that. I can't imagine him not being at this point, considering where the roster is at on the defensive line specifically. So there is that. But let's talk about our favorite thing that fans always love as well. We're not going to get into mock drafts necessarily until after free agency happens, and Denver could add more draft capital by then. George Paton was asked, are you looking to maybe add capital? And he says, we're always looking to add capital. He said, but it's, there's different ways of going about it and how you do it. A lot of these happen in the NFL draft where, maybe someone trades up and you acquire additional capital on the back end. That's something that Denver has done in Payton's time as a member of the Broncos. Or, they could look at potentially trading a player. There could be a trade before free agency, during free agency, or right before the NFL draft that could give them more capital. So at this point, while George Paton says, hey, we're always looking to add, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will. And they currently have 5 picks right now in the 2023 NFL draft, their first picks being a 68 and 69.
They do. It's going to be fascinating to see what they do in terms of adding draft capital. Like you said, George Payton's always looking to add more, but at the same time, as much as we know he loves to have 9 or 10 draft picks, and they've been willing to make deals for guys like Russell Wilson, to trade for Sean Payton. Like, he's not married to these draft picks by any means. And what else do we know from Sean Payton's time with the New Orleans Saints, Cody? They were very, very specific is the word that I'll use about their draft classes. Like a lot of times I would be, doing my write-ups and reviews of the NFL draft, and I'd get to the New Orleans Saints after, this team had 10 picks, this team had 12 picks, this team had 8, 9. And then you get to the Saints and it's like, they got 5 guys in there. They have a lot of draft classes throughout Sean Payton's history that are like that, where they target specific guys, and they don't care if they got 5 picks. They don't care if they got 8, 9, 10 or more. I think a lot of times you hone in on these specific guys when you look at his draft history. So that's going to be very interesting in terms of just Sean Payton's style, George Paton's style, the picks that they currently have, how aggressive they would be. I think one thing to connect all these dots together about what we mentioned in the previous segment about Garrett Bowles, what we're talking about now with the draft picks and Draymond Jones, if the Broncos do have to franchise tag Draymond Jones, I think then a Garrett Bowles trade becomes increasingly likely, Cody, because to add that $20 million roughly to the salary cap, you would have to make some pretty substantial moves to free up cap space to be able to do what you want in free agency, right? Because the Broncos don't have a first or a second round pick. They have to be aggressive in free agency. If you have to tag Draymond Jones, it then means that you may have to make a move off of Garrett Bowles and his deal to save that money, over $9 million if you do that. So to me, the plot really thickens the closer we get here to March 7th in terms of who will be on the Broncos roster, how many draft picks will they have, where will they all be picking. We're fixing to find out here in the coming days.
I'm excited about it because this time of the year, there's so much smoke and mirrors, right? And you have to figure out, okay, what's real, what's not. And look, going into it, we have our idea maybe how some things may play out at certain positions or with certain in-house free agents. But then we can just be totally surprised, like, wow, they let this guy go and they traded this guy? Oh, like, we're in that type of season, right? So I think it makes it even more exciting for Broncos fans, but it also creates more talking points. It creates more speculation. And like I said, I'm fully invested, Sayre, as I know Sean Payton knows how to do his job. So for me, until like he shows me otherwise, I'm going to trust in what he's doing. And I think Broncos fans should as well. We've been preaching that here on the show, and we'll see how things go. But it's going to be a busy week here at the NFL Scouting Combine. We're looking forward to watching some of the athletes test. And then it's NFL free agency on March 15th. It's going to be a wild ride, and we'll have you covered here every step of the way. The Locked On Broncos podcast on your favorite audio podcasting platform or on YouTube. You can get us every single day. We just want to say thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen or your first watch of the day every single day. Sayre Bedinger and myself, we'll be back tomorrow for a brand new episode Locked On Broncos as we take a look at potential backup quarterback options behind Russell Wilson in 2023.